All right, so today we're gonna do a deep dive into a figure who, well, everyone knows him, right? Donald Trump. We got this academic paper from one of our listeners.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it really tries to unpack like his whole presidency. And I gotta say, it's a fascinating read.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's presidency was, you know, I think it's safe to say unconventional, at least.
Hmm?
And trying to really understand it, I think we have to kind of go beyond like the surface level, the noise and all that.
Totally, totally. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at me right away was this idea of the Trump mirror. So the author's suggesting that people's reactions to Trump, whether they love him or hate him, actually say more about them than about Trump himself.
Mm.
Have you ever noticed that? Like, how someone feels about Trump can almost instantly tell you where they stand on like a bunch of other issues.
Yeah, it's funny because it's such a powerful concept. Like, you can almost think about it like Trump's like a Rorschach test, right? For
Yeah.
all of America's anxieties and,
Yeah, yeah.
all that. And so, for example, people who felt like they've been left behind, by the economy changing or by how, culture is shifted. They might have seen in Trump like a champion for their values, right?
Right.
While, other people who felt maybe threatened by Trump, by his rhetoric, those folks might have seen him as, a danger to democracy.
Oh,
You
interesting.
know what I mean?
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's like the Trump mirror in action, right? But this author, the person who wrote this paper, they also have like their own pretty unique perspective on Trump. They describe themselves as a Christian who actually prayed for him to win back in 2016.
Really?
Yeah.
That on the surface, that might seem surprising to some people.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at their reasoning, it gives you kind of a glimpse into like the anxieties, that were swirling around back in that election cycle.
Oh, right.
The author, they were really worried about Hillary Clinton's foreign policy and particularly her stance on Syria. Like they saw her as someone who might be, a hawk, basically, and that she might, escalate tensions with Russia.
Yeah, they even mention Clinton's, campaign promise to enforce that no-fly zone over Syria. And the author was really afraid that, like, that could actually lead to to a shooting war with Russia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so in a way, like, their support for Trump was, like, partly driven by this fear of what a Clinton presidency could lead to.
Right, yeah, I can see that. Like, it was sort of choosing the lesser of two evils type of thing.
Totally, totally. But it wasn't just fear, right? The author also felt like Trump was tapping into like this deeper sense of, I don't know, unease, I guess you could say, among certain Americans,
Yeah.
right? Like they talk about how, there was this feeling that America was declining under Obama
Mm.
and, and that both political parties were basically pushing the same globalist agenda.
Yep.
And so there was this like longing for someone outside the establishment to, shake things up.
Like a real outsider.
Yeah, yeah. It was almost like a political earthquake, like waiting to happen. And then Trump was the one who like set it off.
Yeah. He positioned himself as that, like the anti-establishment candidate.
Yeah.
The voice for the forgotten men and women, I think was one of his phrases, who felt like they were being ignored by, the quote unquote coastal elites and the whole political class.
Right, right. And one of the, I think, key issues that Trump like brought to the forefront of American politics was immigration, right?
Yeah.
It was something that the author really felt was being like ignored or swept under the rug, by the really like, powerful quote in the paper where the author says, Trump was the one who made immigration and illegal immigration a defining issue of the 2016 election and forced the Democrats and the left at large to admit that their ultimate agenda is demographic replacement.
Yeah. And that phrase, demographic replacement, that's one of those phrases that's really loaded,
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's got all these implications behind it. And it's interesting because it's a concept that's been used by, both the far right and the mainstream to describe the changing demographics of America.
Right.
And some people, they argue that these changes are like being intentionally orchestrated, to, I guess you could say, dilute the political power of certain groups.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating to me how the author who, like I said, identifies as a Christian conservative, They actually view Trump's stance on immigration as like relatively moderate.
Uh,
They're more focused on like curbing illegal immigration and
right.
securing the border, right? Which they argue is a legitimate concern for, a lot of Americans.
Right, yeah. And, but even that stance, that seemingly moderate stance, it's still, I mean, the author points this out, it triggered like a whole wave of anxiety and debate.
Yeah.
And remember the Trump mirror? Like, this
Yeah.
is where it becomes real, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, we saw this play out, in the rise of all these new political groups,
Yeah.
and all the heated debates you saw on, like, cable news, and even in how certain media outlets framed their coverage of immigration.
Yeah. So Trump's rhetoric, even if it wasn't like explicitly endorsing the most extreme views, it still acted as this kind of catalyst, like for all these like deeper anxieties to bubble up to the surface.
Exactly, yeah. It really speaks to, the power of language
Hmm.
and how even like seemingly simple phrases can tap into,
Yeah.
these deep-seated beliefs and even fears.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, the author also gets into Trump's relationship with morality and religion. And it's interesting because they acknowledge that Trump himself isn't particularly devout, right? They even say, they describe him as a fairly secular and carnal. Yeah. But they also point out that Trump's stance on certain social issues, especially abortion, really resonated with Christian voters.
Right.
They saw him as someone who, despite his personal flaws, would actually like champion their values, on the national stage.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, it wasn't necessarily about Trump's, personal piety or anything like that, but more about his willingness to, like, to fight for the issues that they cared about.
Totally, yeah. And this actually raises a really interesting point that the author makes. They argue that a political leader can't really be a true, like, moral example for the nation.
Mhm.
And they suggest that America needs, like, a separate religious figure, like someone outside of politics, to actually address, what they see as the moral decline of the country.
I see.
So what do you think about that?
Hmm.
Can a political leader also be, like, a moral leader?
That's a tough one. I mean, because on the one hand, we want our leaders to like embody certain ethical standards
Yeah.
and to, inspire us to be better citizens.
Yeah.
Right. But on the other hand, politics is so often about compromise and pragmatism.
Yeah.
And those things can sometimes clash with, with moral absolutes.
Right, right.
So it's kind of it's a tension, I think, that's been present throughout American history.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's definitely something that the author is like really grappling with when they're, analyzing Trump. They acknowledge his flaws and inconsistencies, but they also see in him like this potential force for good. Someone who, despite his imperfections, might be able to address like the moral decay they're seeing in American society.
Yeah, it's a very complex and nuanced perspective, I think. And it kind of reflects the complexities of both Trump himself and, the era that he represents.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think
Yeah.
as we get further into this paper, we'll see how this tension between like Trump's personal behavior and his political agenda like really plays out in the author's analysis.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where they go with that.
Me too, me too. Okay, so we've talked about the Trump mirror and kind of the author's like personal journey with Trump, but here's where things get really interesting. The author actually argues that that the system itself, like the institutions of American power, were actually stacked against Trump from the beginning.
Yeah, and they point to a couple of key events, I think, that really fueled this perception. First, there are the allegations of Russian collusion. Remember all that?
Oh, yeah.
Which, the author believes those were part of the deliberate effort by the Obama administration and the intelligence community to basically undermine Trump.
They even used the term coup attempt.
Right. Strong words.
Yeah.
They argue that figures like Obama, Biden, and even Clinton, they actively promoted this narrative that Trump was like a Russian puppet, which, really poisoned the well of public opinion from the get-go.
Yeah, and the author really sees this as part of a larger pattern of the deep state working against Trump. Now, just to be clear for our listeners, when we say deep state, we're talking about this idea that there's this like hidden network of powerful bureaucrats and unelected officials, and they're operating, behind the scenes to influence government policy, and often in ways that like contradict what the people actually want.
Right.
It's a concept that's been around for a while, but it really gained traction during the Trump years, right?
Yeah, totally. And for the author, The deep state represents like everything that's wrong with the American political system. It's
Yeah.
this like unelected, unaccountable force that they believe is actively working to like, I don't know, subvert American democracy and erode traditional values.
Yeah, they specifically point to things like the use of intelligence agencies to like investigate Trump and his associates, the
Yeah.
constant leaks to the media, and the attempts to impeach him, all that stuff, as evidence of this like deep state conspiracy.
Right. Like all these things are connected in their minds.
Yeah.
And they argue that this resistance from within the government itself, it created this atmosphere of constant crisis and prevented Trump from really doing what he wanted to do.
Hmm. Now, even though the author is clearly, sympathetic to Trump, they're not totally uncritical. Like, they actually express some concerns about certain policies, particularly his close relationship with Israel, and what they see as like the undue influence of the Jewish lobby in American politics.
Yeah, they find it kind of ironic, that there's all this concern about foreign interference in elections. But then you have a foreign lobbying group like AIPAC that can openly advocate for policies that benefit Israel without much scrutiny.
Right. Yeah.
And they see this as a double standard and a symptom of, like a deeper corruption within the American political system.
Yeah, they're worried that this like close alignment with Israel could, draw America into unnecessary conflicts in the Middle East.
Right, yeah.
The author also criticizes Trump's stance on race and immigration,
Yep.
arguing that he hasn't done enough to address the concerns of white working class Americans who feel, left behind by globalization and all the cultural changes. They even suggest that Trump's views on these issues are basically the same as like the standard 1980s, 90s conservative position, which, they find insufficiently radical.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the author's like kind of moving towards a more, I don't know, maybe nationalist viewpoint, even a populist viewpoint
Yeah.
that challenges, the traditional conservative orthodoxy.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because like they still hold out hope that Trump's personal views might be like more aligned with their own. They point to like his willingness to speak his mind and his bluntness. Like he doesn't care about being politically correct, right? They see that as evidence that he might be holding back from like fully expressing his true beliefs.
So they still see him as a potential, like, I don't know, a potential leader for this movement.
Yeah, yeah.
Even though he's not quite there yet. You know what I mean?
Right. But here's where the author's analysis like takes this kind of darker turn. They share this quote that I think really reflects the growing disillusionment of some Trump supporters. And here's the quote. Many feel that Trump has betrayed them on fundamental issues. Where is our president when we are censored, fired, and expelled in defense of him?
Wow. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
It really highlights like, a sense of betrayal among those who felt like Trump didn't do enough to protect them.
Yeah.
When they face consequences for supporting him.
Right. They specifically point to issues like free speech and gun control, right? Arguing that Trump didn't go far enough in defending these like core conservative values. They're asking like, where was he when social media companies were censoring conservative voices, or when, bump stocks were banned after the Las Vegas shooting?
Right. Yeah. So they feel like he kind of abandoned them, when it really mattered.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a reminder that even among like Trump's most ardent supporters, there were those who felt like he didn't always live up to their expectations.
Right.
And the author ends this section by describing America as being on a precipice with the 2020 election as this potential tipping point.
Yeah, they're really worried about the potential for violence and unrest. Like they suggest that the country could even descend into civil war.
Wow.
Or, face UN intervention or even fragment into separate nations.
That's a pretty stark vision of the future.
Yeah, it's definitely unsettling. But it also kind of reflects, the anxieties of that moment in time. Those anxieties that were just heightened by like the intense political polarization.
Yeah.
And, the erosion of trust in institutions.
Right. And in the midst of all this turmoil, the author is actually like grappling with the very act of voting.
Interesting.
Yeah, like they're expressing this concern that participating in the electoral process might actually signify like a spiritual submission to a flawed and corrupt system.
Yeah, that's a fascinating dilemma.
Right.
Like they seem to be torn between, their civic duty to vote, and then this fear that doing so would be like, condoning all the sins of the system.
Right, yeah. And they don't actually offer like a definitive answer, right?
Right,
They,
right.
they leave it up to the reader to decide, or the listener in this case. They say, I will not say that one should or should not vote. That is between their conscience and God.
Hmm. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's a powerful statement, especially in a time of such, political and spiritual upheaval.
Absolutely.
But they do make one thing clear, I think. They see the 2020 election as a choice between two very different paths for America.
Right. It's a fork in the road.
Yeah, yeah. If Biden wins, they predict like a triumph of globalism and this embrace of what they call the Great Reset.
Yeah.
Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, the Great Reset refers to this perceived agenda by global elites to kind of reshape society and the economy in a way that that some people find alarming, right? It's often associated with ideas like wealth redistribution, increased government control, and a shift away from traditional values.
Yeah, it's a whole worldview, basically.
Right, right. And then on the other hand, if Trump wins, they believe it would buy America some time, like a reprieve from these forces. Although, they acknowledge that globalism would likely, continue to advance even under a second Trump term. But they point to the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it as like evidence of this creeping globalist agenda,
Mhm.
They're suggesting that the pandemic was like used to justify policies that eroded individual liberties and, centralized power.
Right. So things like, lockdowns and mask mandates and vaccine passports, they see those as examples of this trend toward more government control.
Right, exactly, yeah. And they're afraid that a Biden presidency would just accelerate this trend, leading to a more, authoritarian, less free America.
I see. Yeah.
So it's clear that the author views a second Trump presidency as a way to, at least slow down, if not entirely stop these trends.
Yeah.
To preserve, some semblance of the America that they believe in.
Right.
And then in a surprising twist, the author throws out this incredibly provocative idea. Oh.
Yeah. They suggest that despite all of Trump's imperfections and flaws, he could potentially become like this truly transformative figure in American history.
Interesting.
They even use the phrase first American Caesar. Now, that's a phrase loaded with historical baggage, right?
Yeah, I mean, Caesar, of course, was the Roman general who, seized power and became the first emperor of Rome, effectively ending the Roman Republic.
Right, exactly. So what do you think the author is getting at here? Are they suggesting that Trump might actually try to like overthrow the American political system and establish himself as some kind of dictator?
Well, it's not entirely clear, like they don't really go into specifics about how this American Caesar scenario would actually play out.
Right.
But they do seem to be implying that Trump could potentially like usher in a new form of government, one that breaks away from, the traditional two-party system and the constraints of the Constitution.
Interesting.
They even speculate that Trump might like embrace a more monarchical system.
They write, Trump enacting a monarchical government upon the United States would be the best gift and legacy he could leave for his people.
That's a bold statement.
It is.
It's definitely going to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, we're sure. But it's important to remember, that the author's writing from a very particular perspective, one that's, deeply critical of the current state of American democracy.
Right, right.
Like, they seem to be arguing that the system is so broken, so corrupted by special interests and globalist agendas that we need a radical change.
Yeah.
And they see Trump with his, populist appeal and his willingness to challenge the status quo as the potential catalyst for that change.
So it's a vision of Trump as like this reluctant king almost, Someone who, despite his flaws and his ambition, might be the only one who can save America from itself.
It's a pretty dramatic vision.
It is.
But it's also, it's very thought-provoking. It really challenges us to think about, American politics and the future of the country in a whole new way.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And it reflects that deep sense of anxiety and uncertainty that really permeated like the 2020 election and its aftermath.
For sure. I mean, those anxieties are still with us today.
Yeah, they are. Wow. So a lot to think about there.
Yeah, no kidding.
This paper really paints a picture of a country that's like deeply divided, right?
For sure.
Grappling with like some really fundamental questions about who we are, as Americans, where we're going, all that.
Mm-hmm.
But before we wrap up, I think it'd be helpful to like take a step back.
Yeah.
And try to, pull out some of the key insights from this deep dive, right?
Yeah, good idea.
So What do you think? Like, what were some of the things that really stuck out to you?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways, at least for me, is this whole idea of the Trump mirror, right?
Yeah.
And how it reflects those anxieties and divisions that were, they were already there in American society.
Right.
Like Trump didn't create those divisions, but he definitely, uh, I don't know, amplified them, both through his rhetoric and through his policies.
Right. And it's fascinating how the author, even though they're, a Trump supporter, they're still grappling with these complexities, right? They acknowledge his flaws, the contradictions, and the fact that he often fell short of what his followers expected of him. But they also see him as this potential uh, catalyst for change, someone who could like really disrupt the status quo and maybe even usher in a new era of American politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that actually leads to another key insight, I think, which is the author's kind of evolving perspective on the very nature of American democracy.
Right.
Like they seem to be wrestling with this idea that the system itself might be, broken beyond repair,
Mm.
corrupted by special interests, globalist agendas,
Yeah.
to the point where like we need a radical transformation, you know?
Yeah, it's almost like they're suggesting that America is at this like crossroads, right? And we have to choose between clinging to a system that's flawed and failing, or embracing a new path, even though it's uncertain.
Yeah. And they see Trump as like a potential guide on that journey.
Right, with all his imperfections.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bold vision for sure.
It is,
And it's definitely going to be controversial.
for sure.
But I think it also reflects, a deeper sense of unease
Hmm.
and a real longing for change that a lot of Americans feel.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the world of Donald Trump, I guess the question that's left hanging in the air is like, what happens next? What does the future hold for America?
That's the big question, isn't it? And, we don't have a crystal ball.
Right.
But I do think that this deep dive has given us some really valuable insights into the forces at play and,
Yeah.
and the different paths that we might be headed down.
Absolutely, yeah. And ultimately I think it's up to each of us, as citizens to really grapple with these questions and to decide what role we want to play in shaping the future of our country.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So on that note, I think it's time to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to ponder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Given everything we've discussed, how do you view Trump's legacy? What impact did he have on America, and how will he be remembered in the years to come?
Yeah, that's a question that's going to be debated, for years to come
Yeah, for sure.
by historians, by political scientists.
Right.
But ultimately, it's a question that each of us has to answer for ourselves.
That's right. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
We'll see you next time.